Okay, so I'm going to skip introductions, but I did want to apologize that I'm feeling a little bit sick today, but I'm doing my best, so please bear with me. If you're here, hopefully you're here to learn about the results of a project that I did to analyze the data from JoinedIn's OpenAPI. We'll also talk a little bit about the process, but the focus is really meant to be on the results. I also want to say that the talk title might be a little bit misleading. This project covered all events in the JoinedIn database, so that's not particularly just PHP. However, just anecdotally, having worked with this data a lot, I can say that JoinedIn or PHP probably makes up about 75% of the data in JoinedIn's database. So I would say overall, these results are probably still fairly accurately representative of the PHP community. And overall, this is not really intended to be a very technical session. I purposely asked them to keep this for like the last session before the closing keynote, because I know you're all tired. So hopefully this will be something where you can kind of shut off your brain a little bit, go on a little bit of a journey with me. And this is intended to provoke thought more than anything else. I just want you to go home and kind of think about this, and maybe take this into account at the next conference that you attend. So this project was actually a collaboration between 3 of us from my same workplace. So I'm a full stack software engineer, and because this project was working with a lot of data, I also wanted to work with people who actually know how to work with data. And so I asked Erica, data analyst, and Mallory Hughes, a data scientist, to collaborate on this with me. And we did this during our workplace's version of Hack Days, which we call Serendipity Days. It happens about 2 to 3 times a year. It's 2 days long, so it goes pretty fast. And then there's a 3rd day, but that's just for presentations where we talk about what we learned. And we actually did this in August of 2018, so obviously that's kind of a while ago. But I'll talk more about sort of that gap, why it's taken so long for us to talk about this in just a sec. The reason why I wanted to do this was I figured, hey, JoinedIn has this open API. I wasn't aware of anyone actually doing anything with that data before. And so I figured, hey, that's a big, juicy data set that probably has some interesting information that we can kind of work with. I was also inspired by some of my own experiences as a female conference speaker. So you've probably heard many of us speakers talking about the importance of JoinedIn feedback. And I get that as well. I think personally, I have found that it hasn't quite lived up to its potential, at least for me. When I've gotten high ratings on talks, I've gotten feedback like great talk. And when I've gotten low ratings, it's often been things along the lines of the content was good, but I didn't like the speaker. And that's not really useful. That's not something that I can do a lot with. And about a year ago, I was talking to some other female conference speakers and asking them like how they felt about JoinedIn. And I got the impression that most of them were similarly lukewarm on it. But meanwhile, I meet up with my male conference speakers friends, and they're always raving about how useful JoinedIn is for them and how much value they get out of it. And so I was really curious, like, is there a reason why I'm at least anecdotally noticing these patterns where the men are all gung-ho about it and the women are very lukewarm? In other words, is there perhaps some gender bias in JoinedIn feedback? And overall, that kind of at least fits in with my very strong belief that tech is not a meritocracy. So I'll kind of skip to the end because I know that the big question that you all have as I start talking more about the technical stuff is where's the code? And the answer there is it's coming, hopefully. Again, we did this project in August, and we all felt passionate about it enough that we kept working on it in the meantime. But Hack Days are long past, and so now it's turned into something that we can only work on basically in our spare time in the evenings, which means that we're much more limited in the amount of time that we can spend on this. We're lucky if we can meet for like 2 hours every other week. And so one of the main things that we've been working on is a series of 4 blog posts. We really tried very hard to have it done before the conference. Unfortunately, we just ran out of time, partly because Mallory actually changed jobs and I'm planning a wedding, and things like that take up a lot of time. So hopefully within the next couple of months, we can finally get those out. And then we're hoping to also open source the code along with those blog posts. However, because the majority of the code was written on company time, that means we would have to open source it under the company's name, which means we have to get our legal department to sign off on this. So that's also going to take a little bit more time. Our process for doing this, again, this is primarily focused on the work that we did in those initial 2 days, is that we scraped the data from the join-in API and put it into a MySQL database. The reason for MySQL is just because there's so many data analysis tools that are optimized for MySQL that our data analysts and data scientists were already familiar with, so we figured that was just kind of a good choice that everyone knew how to work with. Then there was also some data cleaning and improving optimizations that we needed to do. Then we did some kind of rudimentary data analysis, which were just kind of simple SQL queries to start to look for patterns or interesting results. And then finally, there was a bunch of data science magic to try to figure out if there is actually gender bias. And so again, that's why this is not a very technical session, because I can only talk about the data science magic at a very, very high level, because our data scientist was really the one who was responsible for that. And so she did explain it to me, but I only have sort of like the elementary school understanding of what she actually did. So I'll quickly talk about our process for scraping and cleaning the data, just because that was sort of my biggest contribution to the project as the software engineer, and so I could talk for hours about how we actually did that. The TLDR here is that the tech stack that I used was version 10 of Node.js with TypeScript and the SQLized ORM. The real reason for that just being, like I said, we had 2 days. That's not really time to both learn something new and work on an ambitious project. When you're doing something like this, you really kind of need to stick with what you are most comfortable with. And so in my case, that's actually JavaScript with TypeScript. And then I picked the SQLized ORM because, like I said, the biggest role of the scraper was just to put stuff into a MySQL database. And so SQLized may not necessarily always be like the optimal, most performant way to do things, but for a project where, again, performance was not our biggest concern, it was basically just, let's get this data into the database. It was nice to work with something that has a more of a fluent API and not necessarily having to worry about like getting all the commas right in the SQL queries and things like that. It was also just 100% local command line script. There was no reason for the scraper itself to be deployed to a server, and that way I could also just start and stop it whenever I needed it to. However, the data we did decide to put on a server, at least initially, because that way all 3 of us could be working with the data and doing different things at the same time. And so we just used AWS Aurora for that. That's AWS's relational database flavor of MySQL. And again, this was a 2-day project. There wasn't really time to do anything right, so there was no unit tests or anything like that. It was basically just working with the live data and the live database all the time. And if you're not familiar with it, the joined-in API, that's essentially how it works. It's a bunch of sort of REST URLs. They follow a hypermediate format. So this top one in particular is sort of the overall entry points for the API. And from that events page, you can find individual events. So this link actually goes to the current phpDay. That has URLs that link to, for example, the talks page. And so that has every single talk in JSON format. And then those talks, again, have their own URLs as well. So you can go to the talk page. That can lead you to the comments, as well as, for example, the profile for the speaker. And so the way that the scraper was set up was basically just to keep following all those URLs. So it would start out with this events page, which is paginated. It would put each individual event in the events table in the database. Then for each event, it would go through and put every talk in the database. And then for every talk, it would go through and put every comment in the database. And then it would also put the authors of those comments in a user table, as well as the speakers of the talk. And there's no API keys required for any of this, so any of you can go and do this at home. So by the end of day 2, we kind of ran out of time. We're not able to get all of the data. We got roughly 75% there, and so you can kind of see like how much data we're dealing with. And then later, as we kept working on this, I think we got the rest within like a week. So at the time in August 2018, that ended up being roughly 2,500 conferences and meetups in Joined-in's database. So some of the more interesting stuff is that there were some interesting kind of data challenges that we had to reconcile. The first one being, and I'm guessing that some of you have already been thinking about this, is that Joined-in does not actually collect any data about gender. So if we want to try to figure out if there's gender bias, then what do we do? And so the way that we decided to get around that was using some open source tools to try to guess a person's gender using their name. And I'll talk more about that process in a second. Another interesting challenge, not all speakers have a joined-in account, or sometimes they just don't claim their talks. In our case, that didn't end up being that significant of a hurdle because all we really needed was a name for them, and then we could use that to guess their gender. A more interesting challenge, though, is that talks can have multiple speakers. So in some of our later analysis, you'll see that we got around this by actually focusing on the ratio of speaker gender if there was more than one speaker. So for example, if there were 2 speakers giving a talk and they're both male, we would assign that, for example, a 0. If there's 2 females, we would assign that a 1. If there was 1 of each, we would assign that a 0.5. If there were 2 females and a male, we would assign that a 0.66, basically the ratio of female to men for that talk. Another challenge is that commenters at least used to be able to choose to stay anonymous. I think that's finally been disabled now that I believe the legacy site is offline. I'll talk later about why we also needed to think about commenter gender. And so as a result of that, we decided to just kind of throw out or disregard all anonymous comments. An interesting factor that created is that overall that we found anytime that we were looking at average ratings, we would at least compare average ratings including all comments and then average ratings excluding all the anonymous comments. The values excluding all the anonymous comments would consistently always be higher. So that basically proves that overall people are using anonymous comments to leave more negative feedback. And then finally, there are ways to leave comments that don't have a rating. And so because we're dealing with ratings a lot here, we just kind of decided to disregard all of those as well. So for guessing gender based on name, initially our data scientist started out doing this because she needed something to do while she was waiting for me to build the scraper. And so she's most familiar with Python and R, and so she used these Python libraries. One is called Sex Machine. I didn't pick the name. And the other one was Gender from Name. These were not really good libraries. They had very limited data sets. And so she started searching for better solutions and found genderize.io, which is basically gender based on name guesser as a service that you can pay a monthly fee for. It was like $9 a month. So she decided to just fork over the money and get access to their API. And then later on, we also discovered the service called genderapi.com, which has even more results or names in its database than Genderize. And so we also used those two together for our final sort of genderizer function that we wrote. Now, you might anticipate already that there was one kind of hairy problem with this guessing genders based on name. Using this name as an example. In the US, we would say Andrea, and this is very much a female name. But here in Italy, this is very much a male name. And so the way that we decided to get around that was to try to take location into account. And so for each user, we would look at all of the events that they had attended, and we made the hypothesis that said, whatever country they have attended the most events in, that's probably where they're from. That's a fairly logical conclusion for most users. And once we were able to do that, then we could pass that country code to both Genderize and Gender API. They do both have this feature where you can pass in a country code. And so for this particular query, it would say Andrea is a male name, but if you pass in the country code US, then it would say it's a female name. Now, based on this location logic, it worked for some people, it didn't work for others. Derek is actually, at least in August of 2018, was the most prolific speaker with something like 188 talks, the plurality of which were in the US. But thankfully, Derek is not a fairly kind of gender ambiguous name, so it still worked okay for him. And more importantly, it worked fine for basically everything that might have been otherwise ambiguous, including, for example, an Andrea from Italy who is male and an Andrea from the US who is female. And so using all of this logic, we were able to guess genders for 95% of all the users. And just spot checking it among the people that I knew, there were very few that were inaccurate. I think the only sort of high-profile speaker who had an inaccurate gender was Omni Adams. For whatever reason, it was just convinced that Omni is a female name. So yeah, moving on. So data of results. This is, like I said, the more important part. So obviously, the very first thing that we looked at was just kind of gender breakdown in general among everyone who had either spoken at an event or commented, and therefore attended an event. And it came out to roughly 5-to-1 ratio. Basically, 20% of attendees, I think, roughly were female. And that was also reflected among speakers, and we were looking at as well sort of how many speakers are actually giving multiple talks. And so the red here are male, the black is female. And so again, basically across the board, there's sort of a 5-to-1 ratio of male speakers to female speakers. And it was particularly unusual to find any female speakers who had given more than 3 talks. And Derek, with his 188 talks, is obviously an outlier on this graph. I think the next highest person was Michelangelo with like 122, so there's a pretty big gap. The next one was something that I was very curious about, was just in general, how many comments do female speakers get on their talks compared to men? And so I asked our data analyst to kind of crunch those numbers and figure that out. And she discovered that a female speaker on average receives 13 comments for her talk. A male speaker on average receives 6 comments for his talk. And that was pretty striking to me, and I was kind of trying to figure out why. I still don't have an answer, but my gut sort of reaction to this is a little bit patronizing, perhaps, like to the assumption that females speakers need feedback more than men do. I don't know, it was interesting. And then our data analyst also really likes using word clouds to try to find any sort of patterns in the text in the comments themselves. And so she did this exercise where she calculated what are called bigrams, which is basically pairs of words that often appear together after you remove all of the stop words like a and the, things like that don't have any value. And so this is a word cloud of all the text and all the comments across all genders of speakers and commenters and all ratings. It's probably kind of not surprising. But then we did break it down across the gender of the speakers. And so on the left, you can see for male speakers, on the right are female speakers. And again, this includes all ratings. So there's a little bit of a difference, obviously, but where the difference was most striking was when we looked at just the talks that had, or the comments that had given low ratings. And we interpreted throughout all of this, a low rating is a 1 to 3, a high rating is a 4 or 5. So again, on the left, our comments left on male speakers talks where they received a 1 to 3. And on the right is for female speakers. And this really struck out to me because this kind of helps support my hypothesis that maybe women are just not getting constructive feedback when they are getting negative comments. Whereas men obviously are still getting quite a lot of feedback. And then we did also kind of put all the gender stuff aside and started to look at some of the regional differences. I realized this is really hard to see, and I won't spend too much time on it, but basically the whole idea was we had lat long for some of the events. We wanted to try to figure out if there were regional differences. And so the more red that these circles are was the lower the ratings at the talks at that conference, and the more blue, the higher the ratings. And this particular red circle aside, that's a particular conference that happens every year called Open West, where for whatever reason they always get low ratings. But for everything else, you kind of notice that the US has a lot of blue circles, and it's hard to see over here, but in Europe there's a lot more like pink and slightly red circles. And so that kind of suggests that overall there are higher ratings in the US. And so then we kind of crunched the numbers for that. And so these are all of the countries where at least 30 events have happened. So the US is the highest with an average rating of 4.66. Belgium is the lowest with a 4.23. My interpretation of this data is that this does not actually reflect the quality of the speakers. I think this actually reflects a little bit of a cultural difference in terms of how likely you are to give out a 5 versus a 4. At least for me, I think this is consistent with what I've seen at conferences like DPC, where I feel like you run into many, many commenters who are just kind of like, I'm never going to give a 5 unless you're absolutely brilliant. And so finally, the most important part, the data science magic to try to figure out, is there truly actually gender bias? So again, I can only really talk about this at sort of a very high level based on sort of the way that the data scientist explained to me what she did. But she made a very good point that she was like, if we're going to look for data or gender bias, then we can't just look at just, for example, like average rating for female speakers versus male speakers. We really also need to think about the gender of the commenter. And so that's why we had also done all of this logic to basically determine the gender of the commenter based on their name as well. And so that's essentially what we're trying to map here using a logistic regression model where we basically turned everything into a binary score. So a 1 if a rating is a 4 or 5, which is a high rating, or 0 if a rating is a 1 to 3, which we interpreted as a low rating. And of course, anytime that you're doing this kind of data science algorithm stuff, it is very important to have controls. And so we did control for example, the number of speakers on the talk, the commenter's comment index, which is where this fell in sort of their history of commenting, the attendance at the talk, the year that the talk was given, and the continent that the conference happened in. And long story short, this is what we came out with. So the way to interpret this data is essentially if the speaker is male, or if, for example, if there's 2 speakers and they're both male, then if whether or not the commenter is female or male, their odds of giving this a high rating, which is higher than a 3, is a 1, which is basically even odds. That's basically like a coin flip, essentially. However, if there is more than 1 speaker and 1 is male and 1 is female, or I guess if there were 4 speakers and 2 are male and 2 are female, then if the commenter is female, then their odds of giving that a high rating is actually higher than 1. So they are more likely to give it a high rating. Versus if the commenter is male, then they're actually half as likely to give it a high rating. And then finally, if the speaker is female, or if there's more than 1 speaker and they're both female, if the commenter is female, then their odds of giving this a high rating are 3. Whereas if the commenter is male, then their odds of giving this a high rating are basically a 0.25. So overall, the way to interpret these results is essentially the odds of a male commenter highly rating a female speaker is only 1/4 his odds of highly rating a male speaker. And similarly, female commenters highly rate female compared to male speakers at a ratio of 3 to 1. So obviously that's not ideal, and so we did also want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how do we actually make this better as a culture, what recommendations do we have? So for all of you who are sort of regular users of Joined-In, who are commenting on events, first of all, please comment on men and women's talks at an equal rate. Like I said, at least my interpretation of the fact that women receive double the number of comments that men do is a little bit patronizing. So anytime that you leave a comment on a woman's talk, please also leave a comment on a man's talk as well. Please do examine your own biases as well. I think overall what those results before were showing is that I think we all have this kind of picture in our heads of like an ideal speaker, like the best conference speaker ever. And I think that tends to be fairly influenced either by, if we're speakers ourselves, how we would do it, or perhaps just like this really great speaker that you saw once and now for the rest of your life you're comparing everyone to them. And that's tricky, especially because I do think at the end of the day, there are different ways of delivering talks that are all equally valid. Different speakers have different styles, and that doesn't make one better than the other. And so there should be a sort of more room in your interpretation of a talk and your judgment of it, rather than just, you know, this is my idea of good and everything else is bad. And then finally, again, I'm not saying that you should never give out low ratings, but if you do, please actually accompany that with constructive feedback. So if you're in my keynote yesterday morning, I introduced this idea of the feedback sandwich, where you have basically positive statements, negative statement focused on what you can improve, followed by positive statement for reinforcement. That's a really good way of doing it. There's other ways of doing it as well, but please make sure that your feedback is constructive. And then finally, we had some recommendations for joined in the platform themselves as well. Overall, we believe that the best thing that joined in could do would be to actually add a gender field to the user profile. Whether or not they actually make that data public, I think is up to them. But for me, it's more important that they actually start examining this data internally and thinking more critically about how their platform is serving all users equally well versus serving one group better than the other. And then there's also UI tweaks that they can consider. So for example, there's some language above the comment box that gives an idea for what you could leave in there. And so they could use that as that space with more cues for example, more constructive feedback, some examples of what actually makes a good comment. Something else to consider is actually changing the rating scale. For example, changing it to 1.1 to 6 instead of 1 to 5. That might sound kind of silly, but there was actually a study that was done, I think about a year or so ago, where they were looking at teacher evaluations at a major university in the US. These also had similar numeric scores. They started out with 1 to 10. And when they were using that 1 to 10 scale, they found that female professors were consistently getting lower ratings than male professors did. And then 1 year they decided to change to the 1.6 scale, or 1 to 6 scale. And when they did that, that gap almost completely disappeared. And so the folks who did the study, their kind of theory behind this was when we use a common scale like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, we're doing all of this complicated math in our heads to justify why someone should get the score. But if you use something that feels kind of awkward and unnatural, like a 1 to 6, it kind of becomes impossible to do that math. And so instead, you're really just thinking more about sort of what value this brought to you. And so that their idea was that that kind of explains why that difference existed. And then finally, something that they could consider was actually removing the ratings entirely, because ultimately it's supposed to be about the feedback. And so they could just say, you know, you can't give this a score, you can only leave comments. And that might encourage people to really try to kind of articulate either what they liked about the talk or what they didn't and what they think could be done better in the future. Thank you.